Okay, we have some time for Q&A for our two speakers. Brother in the back there, and then Mitch.
Thank you both so much. I've been doing human rights work in the U.S. for 22 years now, and still fighting despite many moments of hopelessness in this, in the belly of the beast. And Ajamu was one of my mentors that keeps me going and hopeful. But my question is, sort of, in a country like the U.S. where the masses, I think, have internalized the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist norm so deeply, how we break, I agree with you that, it's going to take more than so-called leftists, more than people who identify as activists to really challenge this. And my challenge is always sort of how we move beyond not only our silos across movements, but people who don't necessarily identify as activists, who would never necessarily come to a talk like this, who we're not preaching to the choir about, so that we can have build a real people's movement that is strong enough and large enough to counter such enormous global hegemony.
One of the most inspiring things that I saw years ago from Greece was that when the NATO tanks were there in Greece, young radicals somehow got up to the tanks and spray painted around the word NATO. They made it into Thanatos, meaning death, with NATO, N-A-T-O, and then Thanatos around it. And that really, just that image was it didn't accomplish anything, it didn't defeat anything, but that image was so powerful just in crossing all boundaries. So I just appreciated the young radicals in Greece that did that. In addition to what you're saying, in terms of that our job is to get electoral representatives in Congress and elsewhere to raise these issues, these policies, I think we need to talk about how do we, through our own direct action, begin implementing policies and not just hand it over to these representatives of capitalism to do it for us. I just don't think that would work. In every community, there are targets or potential targets that we need to identify. What banks are funding these things? What companies are facing them? And we could talk here about what targets exist in our own communities, potentially. And then we figure out strategies for going after them, or tactics for going after them. But bring down what seems so impossible up there, down into our neighborhoods so that we have things. And then take direct action around that. And to me, that's important, really crucial. And the other part is to give direct material aid, physical, material resources and aid to those forces who are implementing a radical approach, both here and around the world. And that becomes itself an act. The government's going to oppose it, the government's going to crack down on it. We organize people in defense of that, and it becomes a much more personal, I think, experience for people in our communities so that we have something vested, right, in it. The last thing I just wanted to say, almost aside, but not really, that imperialism takes many forms. It's not just, as you know, right, as you said, it's not just military. It's not just being there with military arms and tanks and machine guns and everything else, but it takes the economic form as well. So one of the things I've been working on is, I just spoke with Ajamu about it, is genetic engineering. That's part of the Green Party program, right? And if we look at the Yugoslavia, the Rambouillet agreements, there was a line in there that says you have to allow genetic engineering of U.S. corporate, of Monsanto's seeds, right in the Rambouillet agreement. Or if you look at Somalia, And part of that was the mass plantations of genetically engineered cassava. So it's not just. And if you look to what is the countries that are one of the few countries in the world that are opposing genetic engineering, Venezuela. And most people don't know that, right? So it leads to another angle to bring in. Venezuela does not allow, one of the 7 countries in the world, does not allow genetically engineered crops and plants, compared to here where the whole Midwest is covered with genetically engineered crops and it's poisoning us, and the spray and the pesticides that go along with that. So there are so many angles and so many ways in our communities, but I would love to have people talk about how do we bring this home and targets in our own communities and not leave it up to, I know you're not saying that we do, but not leave it up to the representatives in Congress and in, because that's so far, or, the president, and then we lose that, it's so far away, hard to reach. So, but thank you very much, because your talk was great.
My name's Paul Gilman. I'm with the Greens. I'm currently here from the Bronx because I really appreciate everybody here, especially Ajamu. Okay, so we're also talking about unifying or getting like people who are not ordinarily active to be active, but also like, I've dealt with a lot of the sectarian left over and over again, and they get all territorial, and so many of them think they have a monopoly on all wisdom and knowledge concerning the movement. And they're almost as despicable as the government. And I'm not talking about ideologically, because you agree with them ideological, but their personal relationships with everybody is horrible. In the Bronx Greens, we had to deal with the ISO, and they were total dipshits. And I'll say that to their face if anyone's in here, because they had no respect for us. We're supposed to be in a coalition. They actually did an event. They superseded us and wouldn't tell anybody where it was. And so these are the people theoretically have the most insight of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist insight, and yet many of them actually put checks on the whole movement because of their territoriality, because they think they're the only ones that can lead the movement. And they have no place at all for actual real coalition, including UNAC. UNAC, I've had problems with them. They refuse to, Joe Lombardo refuses to discuss anything involving the drug war. You want different voices. Well, that's the war on us. And I've given up, and in fact, I love you, but I'm just gonna ignore UNAC from now on because I don't think they're respectful and they treat the Greens like crap. And, we know just as much about things as they do. And I'm going to leave it at that. And can you respond on how we can overcome that, or maybe we should just ignore it and go around it?
We do have a cultural challenge here in this country. We have a left that has not been able to develop in decades. It's because of its disconnection to mass struggles. It has produced some quite unhealthy methods of work, and it's going to take just time to correct that. But part of that process of correcting is we have to have honest conversations. We have to talk about the damages to our overall movement of continued commitment to sectarian kinds of methods of work, and just have those conversations. We have to have those conversations because, the organized element of this society, we're the ones that are going to be involved in the work to gradually win more people over to resistance and to envisioning a new kind of world. It can be very frustrating. We don't see a lot of progress. We don't have access to the people because, of course, the people, the rulers have the ability to influence the population because, of course, they control the corporations that are largely responsible for the information that most people are exposed to. Not only do we have 6 corporations that are able to control 90% of the information and entertainment in this country, now we have basically 3 private corporations that are now involved in the process of censoring information. These tech giants, Facebook, Twitter, what's the other one? Google. They move millions of people onto these platforms under the guise of this being a new and democratic space for information that can be shared. But now that they have done that, now they are in the business of determining what information should be allowed to be disseminated to the American people and to the public in general. So we have an enormous challenge. The only way that we break through, my friends, is these kinds of events, these kinds of conversations, clarity in our engagements with people. I know it's slow, it's incremental, but we have no other choice until we can create a sort of a critical mass of power. We've got to build organizations. We have to build organizations outside of the electoral process. My discussion or my proposal for how we make this militarism an issue in the 2020 election is not a strategy that says we only are going to target politicians and we're going to spend a whole lot of time in the electoral arena. I do believe we have to be in the electoral arena because we have millions of people in that arena. What I'm suggesting is that since we know there are going to be millions of people involved in the electoral process over the next almost 2 years, is there anything we can do to facilitate developing a kind of counter understanding of reality by focusing people's attention on the issue of war and militarism, to have that as something that's debatable among these politicians? To me, if we are not able to do that, again, understanding the enormous power of the state and the kind of destructive activity that the state is involved in, for us to have an election for a president who basically has the ability to impose the U.S. will on nations around the world, for us not to talk about these issues of war and militarism, to me, is immoral. So we've got to figure out how we can penetrate the discourse and have this as an important issue. For us to allow these politicians, without any opposition, to pass these obscene military budgets, $750 billion now. It's not only is it obscene, but again, it's immoral. And they're able to get away with it because there's no accountability. People aren't paying attention. Okay? So we've got to reverse that. The fact that we have 800 to 1,000 bases around the world, most people don't even know that. We've got to bring that to the attention of the public. Okay? So we have this kind of job to do in order to create a more progressive culture, putting people back in contact with their best instinct, trying to reverse the kind of manipulation of the public that we know that the state and the ruling class is engaged in. You know, we have to do it in this way because that's the only tools we have available to us. But we have to figure out how to do that. That make sense?
Here, and then
Ecological crisis is something that is a global civilizational challenge that, as Bauman talked about, he talked about the role of the military and how the military is one of the biggest emitters of carbons on the planet. The way in which these multinational corporations have now corrupted the food production and the food chain in globally. These are all interconnected issues, and it's all part of the kind of progressive or radical program that we have to develop and make people aware of and have people to embrace these programs, and this understanding is part of the everyday existence. It's a challenge because we have diversionary kinds of things that come up, like for example the Green New Deal that the insurgent Democrats borrow from the Green Party and then hollowed out. It has the appearance of being progressive, but it ends up being, in fact, another device to prop up a neoliberal perspective and a neoliberal program. So again, we have to figure out how do we correct that? How do we ensure that people understand that if there's going to be a so-called Green New Deal, that Green New Deal has to be seen as a transitional set of demands going toward what we know has to happen, which is radical social change here in this country. That we can't have a transformation of the economy and a movement toward renewable energy by 2030 without massive and total public mobilization, without, in essence, taking power from the energy companies. If we are talking anything less than that, then basically we're just kind of BSing the people. So all of these, in my estimation, all of these elements are connected and has to be part of a radical program.
It is true that there has been historically huge divisions in the peace movement, and not only in the peace movement, in every movement, right? And there are some objective reasons for that. We know it. Sectarianism has been one. And one of the problems. I agree with you fully. But we have to understand the context of it and deal with it accordingly. You mentioned left sectarianism. I also mentioned center sectarianism from the other side. There are forces that are not willing to work with the left at all, regardless of what kind of left you're dealing with. As soon as you get, oh, these guys are socialist, communists, or whatever, right? Finished. They don't want to join. So sectarianism on both sides. And I would say it's a heritage of the Cold War. It is. We are still suffering from that. That mistrust still exists within the peace movement. On both sides. And we have to be conscious of it, that it is there. We cannot deny it. At the same time, we have to some way of solving it. By discarding each other and saying we're going our own way, we have not achieved anything. It's easy to walk away from the problem. If you want to solve it, you have to stay. Right? And this is what we have to do. And history, our history of work in recent, at least decade or so, has shown that it is possible. If you looked back at 5 years ago, U.S. Peace Council had no relationship with UNITE. Right? Forces we worked with, we are one of the founding members of United for Peace and Justice. We have been working with AFNC, right? And all those people. And none of them are willing to work with UNITE. We're willing to work with UNITE, right? We know that. And UNITE also, on the other hand, in its own way, right? And even within the left, there is sectarianism between groups, right? So we know that. The question is, how do we overcome it? That's the main issue. We shouldn't get angry, we shouldn't get upset. We have to understand that this historical phenomenon that has been imposed on the movement for 70, 80, 100 years, gradually, right? Especially since the Cold War, in the worst way. And we have to overcome it. We know that. Now, what solution did we come up with that made that Hands of Syria coalition of reality? The coalition against U.S. foreign military bases a reality because we had forces from both sides involved. We did on one principle. Let us work on what we agree on together. and not make a big issue out of what we don't agree on. Let's focus the limit of our cooperation on what we agree on for now, and try to expand it as we gain trust, as we discuss through dialogue other issues. Right? That's how we approach it. That's why we have the coalition. Global movement is divided seriously along Cold War divisions. You have the social democratic peace forces in Europe that are allied with the social democrats that are running most of the European countries, right? And the split between communists and social democrats. And then you have the left, anti-imperialists, right? Has existed all over the place, every time. But for the first time in the history of the peace movement, we managed to bring both sides to Dublin together to talk about US NATO bases. And you know, for a long time they argued, because our unity statement mentions NATO. US NATO bases. They were arguing with us. Add Russia and China to this threat, and we will join you. And it was a huge thing going on back and forth. The formula that we came up with that made it possible was a principled position. Yes, we agree, we are against all military bases, but the main threat now comes from NATO. Right? With that simple formula, we got them to agree to join. And it was for the first time that we worked together on that part that we agreed on. Right? Even some people questioned us. Is it the right thing to do to say we are against all military bases?
5 minutes or so. Okay.
Principally, yes, it's okay. Because in a world that there is no imperialism, there will be no need for military bases. Right? The rest of them, if all the US forces are out of Syria, why should Russians stay there? There's no justification. Right? And if you look at it, every time the other side acted, it was in fact a reaction to what US and NATO did. I mean, it's not Russia on the borders of the United States in Mexico. It is us in Ukraine.
Let's try to get a couple
In
more questions
other-
in.
Okay, so let's agree on what we can work on. Let's not discard each other. We need each other in this process.
Okay, the brother here. And
Hi, everyone. My name is Joel. I'm with the Answer Coalition. That's the Act Not to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. It's one of the groups that's organizing for the national mobilization that's happening in D.C. on the 16th, which you all should go to. I'll get to that later. I just want to begin, first of all, great talk, Ajamu. Nice to meet you in person, finally. But in addition to being a part of Answer, I'm also a student of the late black revolutionary and political prisoner George Jackson, who has this quote that I want to read. And he says, the entire colonial world is watching black people inside the U.S. wondering and waiting for us to come to our senses. Their problems and struggles with the American monster are much more difficult than they would be if we actively aided them. We are on the inside. We're the only ones who can get at the monster's heart without subjecting the world to nuclear fire. We have a momentous historical role to act out if we will. Now, I read that like, that's the spirit that I want to capture. I think as a black person in America, that's the spirit, and the spirit of like the hundreds of thousands of people black people that showed up in Union Square in the 1930s after the US supported Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, where hundreds of thousands of black people were in the streets, blocking the subways and having pissed battles with the cops because of that. That's really what I want to capture. That's what I want to go back to. But Ajamu, you posed a question before, and I don't think there's like one answer to it, like about how what happened with anti-imperialist conscience. Why are people like either ambivalent or pro-war, it seems? And I don't think there's one particular answer, but I think that I think people have a hard time conceptualizing the fact that war isn't just like, okay, the president goes to Congress and then they write a bill and then it gets drafted and then they send troops and do this and do that. You know, I don't think it's not that dimensional anymore. Like now we're talking about the use of proxy forces. You know, I have a hard time talking to even some ostensible leftists saying that, oh yeah, it's a war on Syria. Like it was a US war on Syria through the use of proxies. Even the maintenance of neo-colonies, you know, like Haiti, you know, is war. You know what I mean? Like these things are war. And I think people have a hard time thinking that it's war just because there's not like, like a World War II style deployment of troops. And I think bringing that into the consciousness of people is really important for us to do. I also think it's like sort of like a bane on just like, or it's just like this trend of like sort of ivory tower postmodern academia to like reduce progressive movements and socialist movements worldwide, you know, to like single individuals, like, oh, it's Maduro versus Trump, like it's some WWE match, you know what I mean? When in fact the Bolivarian Revolution has it's a project that has the support and involvement of millions upon millions of people. Also in Syria as well, like there's millions and millions of people that support a secular, multinational, multi-ethnic, pluralistic state there. You know what I mean? These aren't just single individuals, and I think that it's a part of like the propaganda game to reduce all this to individuals, and it just becomes this sort of kind of pop culture, you know, style discourse when it actually isn't that. It's a massive imperialist empire that is seeking domination over the darker nations and the poorer nations of the world. It's that simple, really, if you think about it. You know, and it's the whole sort of like both sides are bad thing. It's like, I'm sorry, but like this isn't a both sides issue. Like this is, you know, this has been, the US, even in the US's peace years, so to speak, which there's only been like 7 of them, it still had control over colonies and neo-colonies. The US is always at war. This is a war empire, that's what it does. So the whole thing about both sides being bad is just, it's ridiculous. But anyway, I think I want to address briefly just like what you said about like, you know, how, you know, do we cut across and like build like a movement of the masses? And you know, like I'm not about, you know, mobilize, like, great if other leftist groups or you know, anti-war groups want to work with, that's fantastic, but I'm not mobilizing other war groups, you know what I mean? I think we have to, what you said, mobilize the masses, and I think that if we're anti-imperialist, we have to be anti-capitalist, because imperialism is an extension of capitalism. And so if we believe in the universality of class struggle, which I do as a socialist, then we have to recognize that class struggle is happening everywhere, every single day to people. Between landlord and tenant, between worker and boss, between wherever. And I think we have to build with people on those lines. And to do that, it helps to have an organization that can facilitate winning victories for the people. So that's just my thoughts on that. Also, March 16th, Washington, D.C. I'm leaving flyers. They're right there. We're selling tickets. We're leaving out of Union Square that Saturday, and then we'll be back that Saturday. I'm just going to leave those there. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Ron, if you have a question, and then we'll take the
I guess the question really at the end of it would be about the teachers going on strike just now. Is there any way that we could use that to change the education system of kids away from militarism? You know, I saw a thing in an ad for a travel magazine today that said, if you want to know us, look at our monuments. And when I was in Ireland at the peace conference, as I walked down O'Connell Street, I saw there was a priest, a statue of a priest, a statue of a labour leader, a statue of a person who, a doctor, a statue of somebody who brought water into the city at some time, and the great emancipator Daniel O'Connell. There was 5 statues down that road. When you look at here, with this, to get rid of the statues of the South, they're all soldiers. It's a war. If you look at our monuments, it's all military, you know, and that military gets into every classroom outing to any place that the classes go. I'm just wondering if well, hopefully the statue's getting changed. If there could be like in the cities, the statues of resistance to war statues, to statues of military leaders going up. And also the fact that the teachers are in strike in so many different places, I wonder if they're agitated enough to be accepting of a new philosophy towards the education of the children, because they're not saying it's wages on one hand, but it's the education of our children on the other hand. And what can be done to change the nature of the children? Because I know that just down the road from me there's an ROTC, and you see the children, the seniors, 17, 16, 17-year-olds walking around in their uniforms. Hopefully they're mostly Chinese, and I think that mostly they'll be doing it to get credit for applying to university, having done something like that. But what I'm saying is the militarisation in the schools perhaps could be addressed. And unfortunately, you know, I know it's, if you're depending on 8, 10-year-olds, you know, they're not going to have a voice until they grow up, but maybe that's how far back we have to, because the average American is so military, are looking for a military solution that I think it might be, we have to go to more primary schools to address that situation. Sorry, so the question is, I guess, basically, can the school, the teachers being involved in these strikes and that, do you see any way to utilise that in terms of against war?
That mission to try to reawaken the traditional black internationalism is at the core of what we're trying to do with the Black Alliance for Peace. As you said, you know, the black internationalist position or a tradition has always been one in which we have found solidarity with other oppressed people. It wasn't just about looking at the plight of African people in this country, but looking at the plight of oppressed and colonized people globally, and finding ways in which we could, in fact, unify and support each other's common struggle. That theme of unity, of attempting to concentrate our forces, is something that not only are we trying to do in the black community, but we have to really try to do the same thing in our other communities, including the anti-war community. Our forces objectively are very, very weak. So while all of us want to organize the masses, we also would like to figure out how we can do that in such a way where every organization that has some common missions, if there's ways in which we can figure out how we can find a point of unity so that we can concentrate our powers in order to build the movement we have to build here in this country. That's why, you know, one of the first things we talked about when we talked about the immediate program, we talked about the absolute necessity to get to DC on March 16th. It doesn't matter who's organizing that event. We say that is an issue that has to be supported. That's why we say that if you can't get to the DC on the 16th, or if you get there, if you can find your way back to DC on March 30th to stand with us as we oppose NATO, please consider doing that. Okay? We've got to figure out how we can work in ways that that concentrate our power and rise above what you know, characterizes so much of left work in this country, which is sectarianism. Every, you know, groups that think they have the answer, not saying the answer, we can call it. They feel like they have the correct positions, you know, and that they have the power to do things that maybe other groups don't have. You know, we've got to figure out how we bring along other groups that may not have the same level of organization, but who are involved in valuable work, and see if there's ways in which we can bring those groups along with us in order for all of us to be strengthened as a movement. I mean, the objective fact is we can mobilize the masses for certain kinds of activities, but who's going to do the follow-up organizing? It's going to be sometimes these very weak organizations. So we have a task to try to figure out how we can be more effective as a developing movement here in this country. And I think we have to figure out how to do that pretty quickly. The idea of the challenge of education and the strikes that we see happening across the country, and the way in which the system is able to capture our young people is a very important element of the work we have to engage in. One of the things we're doing, we are launching a campaign on April the 4th in DC, where we're looking at what we call domestic repression. And one of the elements we're going to address is the issue of the militarization of our schools and the recruitment of young people, and primarily young black and brown students, and the collaboration between the schools and the military, something that many people don't even really know about. So we're going to be rolling out toward the latter part of this year a program to try to intensify our counter recruitment efforts, to bring more schools on board in terms of them not cooperating with the military, to break what we refer to as the school to military pipeline. And it's a very powerful pipeline, especially when you have the kind of economic conditions we have today in this country. That, for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, that can't find a viable job, the military, has a message, and I know how powerful that can be. I was in the U.S. military. I also got caught up in the last part of the Vietnam era draft, but I wasn't that concerned about the draft because I had to get out of my community environment. So the military became a viable option, So we have a lot of work to do because we can't just say don't join the military, and we're not in a position to create socially productive jobs at a livable wage, So again, these are just some of the complicated issues we have to address here in this country. Now, the last couple of minutes we have.
I would like to just mention something that I forgot to elaborate on, and that is that this morning a few of us, including myself and Ajamu, Joe was there also, had a press conference at the United Nations press room announcing that the U.S. Peace Council is sending a peace and solidarity delegation to Venezuela from March 10th to 15th. And it's about 15 people on this delegation. From labor, President of Veteran for Peace is going, President of U.S. section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is going. Green Party, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers are going. Popular Resistance. Ajamu is leading the delegation for U.S. Peace Council and Black Alliance. It's a very high-powered delegation, and we want to go there and talk to everybody, all levels. We have expressed to our hosts that we want to come back with lots of evidence and documentation about U.S. manipulation and sabotage and attempts to bring down the Venezuelan government. And we want to share that with the American public since the media doesn't do that. So we are coming back after the 15th and the 16th, and of course the 30th. We will be reporting back again at the UN and at the press conference, the same way we did it with regard to Syria. And we will be starting a campaign in defense of Venezuela in the form of informing the American public about what is in fact going on, and to defend, because the collapse or destruction of Venezuela, if this attempt on the coup succeeds, it's going to be a catastrophe, not for Venezuelans, but for Latin America, and also for the people of the United States. So we have mentioned it in that press conference, that think about the hundreds of thousands and millions of refugees that can result from that, right? And look at the Trump policy, anti-refugee policy, and how many more thousands and tens of thousands will be accumulating at the border. And it's going to be a huge humanitarian disaster as a result. So at all costs, we should stop this effort to bring down the Venezuelan government. And this is what we are committed to do when it comes back. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our two guests. Thank you for coming out on a not very pleasant, cold night when it's going to snow in a few hours. I just want to mention one little victory. We in the Queen's Peace Council had a role in it, and other groups, as well as the Vets for Peace and U.S. Labor Against the War. We have a council member, Idanis Rodriguez, the first resolution calling for a hearing in the City Council on moving money from the military budget to human needs. And believe me, the City Council doesn't do things like that. So there's a press conference on City Hall steps, 9:30 tomorrow morning. If you're interested, some of us are going. So it's a big victory. It took 2 years of work. And some of the heroes are Bob and I see Jim Gaffney here and others. So it's we want to brag about it for at least 10 seconds. Anyway. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you very much.